you're kind of regarded as the perhaps the kind of the father of humanistic therapy in Britain, but you've also written a lot about the transpersonal psychotherapy as well, which is what we're going to be talking about here today. I just wanted to start with a quotation from one of your papers, which you might well recognise, and the quotation goes as follows: "One of the most important facts about the transpersonal is that it has no centre, no founder, no basic texts, just a number of people who are all trying in their various ways to make sense of what Maslow called the farther reaches of human nature." So I just wondered whether you'd like, with that quotation as a kind of backdrop to what we're going to speak about, whether you'd like to begin by speaking about your own history with the transpersonal and particularly how it fits into your humanistic work, because you are very much recognised as being a pioneer in the humanistic field, and I'm particularly interested in whether the transpersonal kind of emerged from the humanistic view, or whether it was there right from the outset.
Well, I suppose it was right there from the outset, but I didn't think much about it until 1980. See, I spent the years from 1970 to 1980 going to groups, basically, and also doing co-counselling. And I had enormous breakthroughs and enormous rebirths and enormous emotional experiences over that period of time. And so by the end of that period, I declared myself to be self-actualized. And at that time, that was quite a rare idea, because in the 1970s, most people thought that self-actualization was sort of end of the road. Get self-actualization, bingo, that's it. You are it. You are as far as you're ever going to go.
You're kind of realised.
You're realised,
yes,
fully
yes.
realised. Yes. And authentic. Don't forget authentic. And so in 1980, I declared myself self-actualized, or what Carl Rogers called a fully functioning person. In other words, in Jungian terms, I had dealt with my shadow. I dealt with all the aspects of my shadow that could possibly be come up, because they pretty well all come up. So the question then is, if you're self-actualized, what next? There's a real question there. Okay, so you're an authentic person, so what? So what? Then? Well, so what then? And so I went to the local Rajneesh place, and I explained my problem, and they said, well, you just have to jump in. I said, yeah, but I want to know whose swimming pool I'm jumping into.
Oh yes.
See, so I was a bit suspicious of that. And then I went to the Raja Yoga people in Cricklewood, and they taught me a form of meditation where you meditate on this white light in the middle of your forehead. And every time I did that, I fell asleep. So it wasn't a lot of use to me. And then I also went to Sogyal Rinpoche, who's the great Zen teacher in London. And I told him I was in the land of the hungry ghosts, because I wanted to use Buddhist terminology and so forth. He didn't seem to make much of that, and I didn't get much out of him. So I was at a party, and I was explaining my problem, and this woman said, why don't you read Ken Wilber? I think you'd find him interesting. He writes a bit like you, and I think you'd like him. So I started reading Ken Wilber, and that was exactly what I needed. I felt, he was so accurate about where I'd been up to that point. He was so completely on the ball, on the button.
In terms of psycho-spiritual development.
That's right.
Yes.
And so I thought, wow, what does he say comes next? And what he said came next was the subtle realm of consciousness, which is full of symbols, images, archetypes, deities, angels, devils, nature spirits, and so forth, all that kind of stuff. Legends, myths, fairy tales, dreams. And by coincidence, by pure coincidence...
Oh, is there such a thing, John? We'll come back to that later. Go on, yeah.
A guy came up to me who I'd done a lot of political work with in the past. He said, we're starting a moon group. Would you be interested? I said, that's exactly what I'm looking for. That's exactly what I need. That's right. So I joined the moon group. And so this was a group led by a woman called Bucky from America, who'd been initiated into the Wicca tradition, neo-pagan tradition. And she led us through all the stuff about the 4 directions and the altar at the north and gods and goddesses and all this kind of stuff, and chanting, and not much chanting actually, and nudity, not much nudity actually, and all this Wiccan stuff. And so I pursued the subtle realm for 10 years and wrote a book called The Horned God,
Yes.
which I believe is just going to be republished.
Oh, excellent.
Actually.
Good.
They're bringing out some of these early feminist texts again.
Yes.
The subtitle is Feminism and Men as Wounding and Healing.
Yes, that was when you were working with Justin Chaplin a bit,
Right.
was it?
Well,
Yes. Yeah.
So that was my introduction to the transpersonal, and it's the most accessible part of the transpersonal, I think. And it's crucially important because I've been writing recently about what I now call third-tier thinking. You see, spirodynamics, which is a sort of well-established form of thought, says the first-tier thinking, which is what everybody normally has, where A is A and B is B and 1 is 1 and 0 is 0. All computers ever made work on this kind of logic, formal logic, Aristotelian logic, Boolean logic, Newtonian logic, whatever. And but second-tier thinking is dialectical logic. And dialectical logic, 2 things can be true at the same time. You can have paradox, you can have contradiction. It's all right. It's not bad. And it's terrific with psychotherapy because, you see, with first-tier thinking, Richard comes into the room as a client, and I say, Richard is Richard. Well, it's very boring.
Yes.
There's nothing much there to...
It kind of closes things down.
That's it.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
But in dialectical thinking, the corresponding statement is, Richard is not simply Richard. Now, you see what difference that makes?
Yes, that kind of opens up immediately.
Right. So that's a terrifically important, and I call that crossing the great gap when you move from first-tier thinking to second-tier thinking. Now, third-tier thinking is very little talked about. And I'm one of the pioneers of talking about
let's hear about it.
third-tier thinking. And the thing is, in third-tier thinking, which applies to the subtle realm that I've just been talking about, you cannot ask the question, is it true?
Okay.
Instead, you have to ask the question, and what effect did that have on you? Now, somebody says, I saw a fairy at the bottom of my garden.
Yeah.
You don't
don't argue about the truth status of that.
What?
You don't argue about the truth status of that.
No. Don't ask the question, have you got the pictures? Did you make a report? Have you got witnesses? Blah, blah, all that kind of stuff. You ask the question, and what effect did that have on you? Completely different thing. And it's the same with if you're kidnapped by people from a UFO and taken up to a spaceship. What effect did that have on you?
Yes.
See, you don't bother. And it's actually the same with previous lives. You see, great mistake with working with previous lives. If you say, now, what street was it in? Is there a real street with that real name? Well, who was the person? How old were they? Can we check this up from the records and so forth?
Yes.
You ask, what effect did that have on you?
So you're more interested in process than in content.
That's it.
You go to process rather than stay with procedural content. Yeah.
So This was what I was learning all about this stuff from 1980 to 1990.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's how I got into the transpersonal. And then, of course, the next question was, where do you go from there?
Mm.
And I was in therapy with Ian Gordon Brown at the time, who's now dead, unfortunately, a great pioneer of a transpersonal in this country.
Mm-hmm. With Barbara Summers.
Sorry?
With Barbara Summers.
Barbara Summers, yeah.
Yeah, right.
And I said, according to Wilber, the next step is to go into the causal realm.
Mm-hmm.
But how do I do that? And he said, you just do it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it wasn't very helpful. I mean, I didn't feel as though that was a big guide.
Yes, well, he was giving you a bit of a sort of Krishnamurti Zen answer. I mean, he was determinedly not answering your question in the way that you were wanting him to answer it, I would think. Yes, yeah.
So what Wilber said was that the only thing that held you back from going into these more advanced mystical realms was your contractions. And your contractions are all the things you tell yourself, like, I'm not worthy, I'm not ready, I'm not good enough, I'm not old enough, I'm not young enough, I'm not nice enough, I'm not pure enough. All these kind of ways in which you
sort of negative injunctions
get into your own way,
yeah.
stuff like that. So next time I was meditating, which I've done ever since 1982, every morning.
Okay. For 30 years. Mm.
I said, okay, let's drop the contractions. And at the moment I did that, I was in the causal realm, and it was a realm of complete freedom. There are no problems at the causal level. There's nothing to worry about. There's nobody to worry in actually. So this is what in mystical terms is called the shunyata, the void, the emptiness, the absolute, the ultimate, the whatever. So it was really easy. So I spent the next 10 years reading about that and exploring that and writing about it and so on and so forth, various angles of it and so forth. And then I went into the non-dual for the next 10 years. And the non-dual is none of the above. So that's the sort of mystical realm proper, so to speak.
So can I ask you a question
That's how I got into transpersonal.
Okay. So it doesn't sound like for you it kind of emerged from humanistic practice and humanistic psychology.
I think the humanistic makes it possible.
Right, okay.
You see, if you go into meditation without having done any of these earlier things, meditation is the way of getting from the subtle to the causal. That is the method, you see. But you're not ready for that until you've dumped your shadow. And dumping your shadow is a task of psychotherapy. Okay. And that's what humanistic psychology is terrifically good at. Dealing with your shadow.
Right, okay. Well, it's interesting because you've preempted one of my later questions, which was to talk about what Robert Sardello writes about when he says that there's a great danger in human beings going straight to the kind of spiritual level without having done the necessary soul work first of all.
Absolutely.
And you're saying something along those lines.
Absolutely, yeah. And Wilber says very clearly, therapy cannot do the work of meditation. Meditation cannot do the work of therapy.
Yes.
They are two different things dealing with different objects, different subjects, different stuff.
Yes. So can I ask you, coming out of your journey, the way you've described it, which I must find absolutely fascinating, would you say that in order for a practitioner to engage in transpersonal work, it's necessary for them to have let's say a kind of model of psycho-spiritual development, or a kind of sort of cosmology? Because obviously Wilber has a very, very well kind of thought through and very, very closely argued developmental process, whereas I think at least some transpersonal people are quite kind of critical of that kind of way of conceptualizing the transpersonal. There's perhaps an argument that the very act of kind of systematizing something and conceptualizing it takes us to a place which is not the transpersonal. I don't know what thoughts you have about that.
You see, I don't think that matters. I talk about the subtle and the causal as if the subtle was preliminary to the causal. You see. But people have put to me the view that in yoga, for example, the subtle corresponds to bhakti yoga and the causal corresponds to jnana yoga. Well, I don't care, that's fine. And they're equal, you see, they're fine. They're both equally yoga. And my view is that I don't care. As long as you admit that it's two separate things, I don't care whether you call them bhakti yoga and jnana yoga, or whether you call them anything else. As long as you admit that the rules are quite different in these two realms.
Yes.
The one is full of activity, enthusiasm, ecstasy, colours, lights, action, and the other is kind of nothing much, you know. As long as you admit that they're different, great. You know, I don't insist on Wilber being right. I think Wilber has got a pretty good map, which is quite usable for therapists.
Yes.
Not necessarily for academics.
Yes.
Academics seem not to like Wilber very much. They find him not quite, etc., etc.
Not quite what? I'm interested in the word
not
that's missing
quite
there.
Academic. They won't accept him.
Not quite sufficient.
They won't
academic.
accept him as a philosopher.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And is that intrinsic to what he's kind of writing about? That there is a real issue about Steiner, for example, has been ignored, by the academy, and his work, which is full of the most extraordinary kind of insights, and yet the academic world completely ignores his work. And is it a similar kind of process?
It's a similar kind of thing, I think, that because he hasn't come through the right routes. In fact, he started all this business as a reaction against his training, which I think was in biophysics or something. It was something quite very scientific anyway.
Yeah.
And he came across the I Ching, the Tao Te Ching. He came across the Tao Te Ching, and he was so turned on by this that he started getting all these Eastern books and stuff.
So that would around the time that Fritjof Capra wrote the Tao of Physics.
Exactly.
In the mid-70s, probably.
Although Wilber has a pretty strong critique of
Capra.
Anyway, we'll go to that. Yeah.
And of course, there's the great let's call it the great debate that's been had between John Heron and again Wilber, and they've kind of
and Jorge Ferrer
crossed swords quite vigorously.
I actually respect Jorge Ferrer more than I do John Heron, because actually John Heron wrote a book in 1988 which was pure Wilber. I mean, it was hierarchical, it was the same kind of levels, slightly different labels, exactly the same. And he wrote in his preface to this book, which nobody ever talks about nowadays, that this book was dictated to him by a group of dead doctors.
That's interesting. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
I'll have to look into
so
that one.
he has a certain history which he doesn't talk about. But Jorge Ferrer is very well respected in academic circles, and I recently had a bit of a ding-dong with him in the pages of the BPS Transpersonal Psychology Review. And his main point is that you don't have to have a hierarchical. You don't have to have what is called the Perennial Philosophy. Actually, it gets so complicated, but it's interesting, I think. There are two versions of the Perennial Philosophy. Both versions claim that they are the authentic perennial philosophy that everyone has always agreed on, and all people who study these matters come to the same conclusion, which is the causal, actually. There's the one group, which is Schuon and two other people whose names escape me for the moment because I don't like them. They are non-developmental, non-hierarchical, non-evolutionary.
Okay.
Whereas Wilber is down to the bottom roots, evolutionary. It all develops through natural causes and so forth. And so when people accuse him of having a hierarchical model, he replies that there are two kinds of hierarchy. There's the imposed hierarchy, where somebody says, I will dominate you and you will dominate the one underneath and you will dominate the one underneath that, and so on and so forth. And there's the natural hierarchy, which is the way evolution develops. So there will always be more molecules than atoms. There will always be more organisms than molecules. There will always be more vertebrates than there are, I went the wrong way up, more of the simpler things than they are the more developed things. And so this is what Edward Lear called the rule of the higher the fewer. Oh, that's right. No, it's Alice in Wonderland, isn't it? Why is a mouse when it spins? The higher the fewer. That's the answer.
Of course, the problem with this word hierarchy is that for most of us, as soon as we hear the word, it triggers off all kinds of associations about power and powerlessness. And
it's a pity. It's a pity because it doesn't necessarily mean that. I mean, nobody accuses vertebrates of dominating invertebrates, but there's still a lot more invertebrates than there are vertebrates.
Can we move a bit towards to the actual practice of transpersonal therapy? Because I think our viewers will probably be interested to hear something about that. I'm kind of interested in what would you say to the question? Is it possible to kind of distinguish between a practitioner working in a transpersonal way versus a practitioner who's not working in a transpersonal way, and what might be the kind of discernible differences between those two?
Well, I think the difference with the transpersonal is that the transpersonal agrees and insists that the client has a soul and a spirit, and refuses to omit that or forget about that and so forth. And so I work a lot with cushions. And so when somebody has a difficult decision to make, I sometimes put out 3 cushions. I used to put out 3 cushions on the thing. What does your body think about this decision? What does your heart, your emotions think about this decision? What does your intellect say about this decision? And that was very useful. Made decision making quite fuller and more.
It's almost taking Gestalt therapy into the transpersonal realm.
When I entered more into the transpersonal, I said, what does your body think about it? What does your emotions think about it? What does your intellect? Well, what does your soul think about it?
Okay.
And to people who hate the word soul, of whom there are quite a few because they were damaged in their youth by religious rubbish, I say, you can use the word higher self, you can use the word inner teacher, you can use the word inner shaman, whatever phrase or word means that to you, you can use that. But I just mean the part of you that is kind of transcendent, sort of holy, anything like that, And when I do that, the answers that come from the soul cushion are invariably wiser. than the answers that come from the others. So that's one obvious difference, that the transpersonal therapist includes that aspect of the person, which other people are ignoring. You see, and I don't think it's right to ignore that. I don't think it's just or fair to look at this person who has a soul, a spirit, and never refer to that, and never say anything, a word about it. You know, how are you treating the whole person if you're leaving out this chunk, which I think is as important as any other? You know?
Yes.
So,
and of course, some people with a kind of materialistic, non-religious, atheistic worldview wouldn't understand that sort of language, but they probably wouldn't find themselves coming to see a transpersonal therapist.
No, they wouldn't. No,
so,
no, that's right. Yeah.
I wonder if you could say something about maybe the kind of themes that can or do come up in transpersonal therapy. And I know that's a very broad question, and
I don't think the themes are really different, particularly from any other therapy, except when, of course, the client gets interested in transpersonal themselves, and they start saying things like, "I'm reading this book. What do you think about that?" You know, and I might or might not have a view about that. But one of my attitudes I developed as a humanistic therapist, which continues very much into my work as a transpersonal therapist, is the client is allowed to ask questions like that. Did you read this book? What do you think about it?
Right.
What do you really think about me? And I can answer those questions, you see, because I don't see a difference in level between me and the client. We're both spiritual beings.
Right. Okay. So that's a very kind of Rogerian view, but
no, it's more than
yes. But my but was that it's taking it to another level.
Yeah, I think it has.
Yes.
And I was actually alerted to it by a guy called Philip Lichtenberg, who was a Gestalt therapist, and he was the one who first broke it to me that the client might actually talk back. I mean, we're so used in therapy to the client talking, but the client talking back. I don't know whether I think
it's essential that the client talks back. I would always want to be a therapist for whom the client feels able to talk back.
Well, I think that's become much more accepted nowadays, even with the psychoanalysts. The relational approach has seeped in everywhere. Everybody's doing a relational approach now. I mean, even the existentialists, who used to be, Jean-Paul Sartre, free and alone, without assistance and without excuse. None of that now. They've forgotten about Sartre. He doesn't exist anymore. It's all these nicer people like Heidegger, who I think is a very mixed up guy actually, but
brilliant philosopher though.
Oh yes, he was a proper philosopher.
So would you do you like Petrushka Clarkson's model of was it 5 different relationships all happening at the same time, of which the transpersonal is a really important one? I
do, absolutely, and I've talked with her many times about this and criticized her view of the transpersonal. I think her view of the transpersonal is rubbish. She doesn't refer to any of the people in the transpersonal tradition, the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology and so forth, those kind of people. She makes up her own idea of the transpersonal based on the idea of some Greek word.
Physis. Physis, yes, yeah.
I mean, where she got all that Physis stuff from, I don't know, but it's nothing much to do with transpersonal, as I understand it. And she doesn't make much of this transpersonal But I absolutely agree with her that
Yes.
it's one of 5 relationships
Yes.
all going on at the same time,
Yes.
which you
Yes.
can either pay attention to
Yeah.
or not.
Yes. Yes.
And that's the brilliant
Yes.
insight, I think.
Yes.
Top marks. I think her book on the transpersonal relationship should be read by everybody who does therapy, no matter what background they come from, because it's the best book on the therapeutic relationship. It just is the best. Although,
and yet you really do take issue with her particular approach to the transpersonal, and that perhaps leads me to another question about possibly part of the difficulty of even speaking about this field is that it is so diverse. I mean, I actually made a list of all the different what could be labelled as transpersonal ways of working, and I've probably missed many. And I've put Wilber-based approaches, Jungian-based approaches, psychosynthesis, Steiner-based biographical counselling, shamanic therapy, Robert Sardello's soul practice, kind of Brian Thorne's mystical person-centered therapy, even the psychoanalysts. Michael Egan has written a book called The Psychoanalytic Mystic. So there's so many different kind of strands and fields to the transpersonal, and I wonder if you've got any sense of whether there might be any kind of common themes that would hold all that lot together in some sort of way.
Yes,
I'd be interested to hear what you say.
I mean,
about that.
psychosynthesis, for example, is a lovely map, very great clarity about a lot of things, and the realm that they're really good at is the subtle realm. They don't have much to say about the causal, actually. You left out a very important name of H. Olmas. Very important transpersonal training he does at the moment, called the Diamond Approach. Some very good stuff in there. I think a lot of them are quite reconcilable. Certainly psychosynthesis and Wilber fit together perfectly well. No problem about that. What were the other ones?
Brian Thorne's mystical person-centered therapy, Robert Sardello's soul practice.
Yes, I know.
Steiner's
Come across
biographical
Sardello.
counselling.
I'm not competent to talk about Sardello because I don't know him. But there's a guy called Brent Cartwright in California, very compatible stuff, very good on the subtle realm.
So it's a very rich field of great.
I think a lot of it is very compatible.
A sort of unity in diversity.
Yes, I don't find the diversity hostile or problematic.
Yeah.
I think it all fit together pretty well, really.
Right.
I don't see great feuds and divergences and problems. I go to a lot of transpersonal conferences. I went to one in Latvia this year, and people get on very well together. They don't seem to be at daggers drawn or anything. Partly because they tend to be quite tolerant people. Transpersonal people seem to be pretty open and non-confrontational. That sort of thing.
Well, hopefully they've kind of worked through a lot of their kind of soul level issues, or their shadow, to use Jungian terminology. Yeah.
But there are still some pretty dogmatic ones about. And also, I don't think transpersonal people are very good on the question of democracy. For example, coming from a humanistic tradition, if we gave a lecture, we would always allow time for questions and discussion at the end of the lecture. Transpersonal people speak for an hour and a half, boom, that's the end.
Okay,
goodbye.
so what do you think that might be about?
I think it's non-democratic. You see, I think it's a little bit of not recognizing somehow that there's space for disagreement. There's a sort of thing about the transpersonal. You sort of discovered it for yourself very often. And so it's true. Well, of course it's true for you. But to then sort of put it out as if it's the truth,
yes,
well,
yes.
I hope not too many of them do it, but
it can shade into dogmatism very easily.
It can shade into dogmatism quite easily.
Yes,
yeah.
I mean, perhaps one should say that just as therapy should not ignore the transpersonal, as you say very clearly in this article I quoted from earlier, maybe we should say that the transpersonal shouldn't forget about the humanistic as well.
I think that's important, actually. I think that's very important. Transpersonal therapy that forgets its roots, so to speak, in the humanistic, I think is less worthy, less viable, less good, less okay.
I asked, well, I didn't quite ask you this question earlier, but it sort of came up, something about perhaps the way a transpersonal therapist might actually work, and this distinction between sort of content and process is one that I always kind of invoke in many ways, and I think perhaps it's very relevant here too. Perhaps it's kind of less helpful to talk about what would be the difference in the kind of sort of content of therapy sessions, comparing a transpersonal and non-transpersonal work. It's more about the process and kind of the attitude of the therapist and what the therapist is bringing in their being kind of to the work. Would you say that makes sense?
Well, there's an important question there, which is what transpersonal level are you working at? Are you working at the subtle level, or are you working at the causal level? Now, these are very different, because at the subtle level, empathy is so important that somebody called it transcendental empathy. It actually goes, at certain moments at the subtle level, the barrier between the mind of the therapist and the mind of the client disappears.
Just dissolves,
completely.
Yeah.
And some of the person-centered people are exploring this area at the moment under the heading of working at relational depth.
Peter Schmidt and Mick Cooper and those people.
And I've contributed a chapter to their book coming out next year on that, emphasizing the transpersonal side of it. But there's also the causal level. Now that is quite different, because if you're in the void, so to speak, and there's nobody there and there's no problems there, how can you possibly do therapy? See, and I used to think for a long time that you couldn't. It was ruled out, But then I tried it, and it worked quite well. And what happens is that you look at the client and you see through all their problems and all their fakery and all their rubbish and all their self-induced pain and suffering. And you say, well, why are you doing this to yourself? What's the point? What's that all about?
What's the meaning of that? Or,
yes. There's an example on a DVD actually where I'm doing the demonstration of working at the causal level in an Italian conference. Unfortunately, it's in Italian, although it was translated for me at the time with earphones and so forth. But this woman came up and said, I'm so worried about my personal development. And I said, who is asking this question?
And that stopped her in her tracks.
And it made for a very good little 10-minute, 15-minute session. And it's actually on the film there, on the DVD. So, and I remember a time, again, you have to have the client's permission for this, because it's confronting, very confronting.
Yes, absolutely, yes. You need to know that your client is able to go there.
I remember a client saying to me, I'd like to do a causal session, it sounds interesting, And I sort of looked at him and I said, I see you dodging behind pillars, dodging behind stones, dodging behind anything that's handy, and so forth. Well, this was a guy, and he said he'd take up yoga. He didn't. He said he'd go to the swimming pool. He didn't. He said he'd take up salsa dancing. He didn't. He said he'd take up martial arts. He didn't, and so forth. And it became a very useful bit of his therapy, simply to say, well, let's explore this, which we did for 4 or 5 weeks. Just simply seeing through all pretenses. What are you doing? What are you up to? You know. And I must say this story. It happened spontaneously once. I did a weekend in Ireland, and on the afternoon of the Friday for the weekend, they gave me 2 or 3 individual clients. And this woman came in, aged about 45, and she started talking about her mother and how awful her mother was and how she'd suffered from her mother and blah, 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 for about half an hour. And then he suddenly stopped.
Those are the important moments, yeah.
And she said, do you know, I've been carrying this stuff around for 40 years. It hasn't done me a bit of good. Why don't I just drop it? She started laughing. And I started laughing, and she went on laughing, and I went on laughing. We both carried on laughing till the end of the session, and that was it. And ultimately, that's what therapy is all about. It's about dropping.
Being able to let go.
Yeah.
Which is one thing that human beings find very difficult.
They do. Most
of the time, perhaps.
So most people are hanging on to their problems for all they're worth.
Something that I haven't named yet, it's sort of come up a bit kind of vicariously in the conversation. Could you say a bit about this notion of the pre-trans fallacy? Because I think that's something that kind of comes out of Wilber and other writers. I think it's enormously important, and I thought perhaps you might just say a bit about that.
Oh, I think it's very important. Wilber says that in the course of our psychosocial development, we go through 3 main phases. The pre-personal, the personal, and the transpersonal. So, simple enough. And the pre-personal is all the stuff that goes through our childhood and through the childhood of the race also, so to speak. This is sort of undeveloped membership stuff. I'm not a person, I'm a member of a family, I'm a member of a tribe, I'm a member of a group, whatever. Very important early stage for all of us. So if you ask a 7-year-old, who are you? And he'll say, well, my daddy does this, my mummy does this, that's appropriate terminology. And
a necessary stage of human development.
Yes, yes. And in that stage of development, you can have spirituality. You see, the kind of spirituality you can have is fundamentalism, because it's still very black and white, it's still very us and them, it's still very inner and outer, the in-group, the out-group, and so forth. And so we in here know the truth, and those out there not only don't know it, they may actually be opposing it, and therefore they may be dangerous, and therefore they even get so dangerous I might have to kill them. So, but it's a genuine spiritual level, which has very keen on gods and goddesses and rituals and symbols and all this stuff and so forth, rather than anything intellectual. Transpersonal, as I said earlier, in the subtle stage, you've got images and symbols and gods and goddesses and so forth. So the intellectual in the middle here, looking at some particular phenomenon, some particular piece of mental work, involving angels, let's say, or devils, or whatever, and says, well, I can't see any difference between these pre-personal people, supposedly simple. Actually, I don't think they're simple. I think they're deeper than the rest of us. I think they're actually go deep into the history of the race and worthy of study and so forth. And these people, I don't know, they're jumped up so-called superior people. I don't know much about them and so forth. As far as I'm concerned, I am the true thinker because I think in logic and rationality, and I've got science and all these marvelous modern things that we all respect and value. I won't say love exactly, but they are. So I think they're all the same thing. Any departure from rationality must be inferior. And so the Pretrans fallacy to say these two things are just the same. And there's actually a book come out by Albert Ellis. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Of course.
He wrote a book called Why Some Therapies Don't Work.
Yes, I know the book, yeah.
And it's all about transpersonal. And the transpersonal, they have black magic, they have ritual killing, they have prejudice, and so on and so forth. He can't tell the difference between the prepersonal and the transpersonal. So the pre-trans fallacy is simply mixing up stuff that hasn't reached logic yet with stuff that has gone beyond logic as ordinary stuff.
So for a transpersonal therapist, this would be an essential capacity to be able to discern the difference.
Absolutely, yes. And I'm in process of writing an article at the moment on the pre-trans fallacy for the Pagan magazine.
I look forward to seeing that. Yes. Could you? We haven't got that much time left. I just wondered whether you might say something about the paranormal and perhaps does what's termed the paranormal necessarily come into transpersonal psychotherapy, or it kind of might do, or there needs to be a space for it to if it needs to? I wonder what you think about that.
Well, there are some very able people who say that they should be closer. But I had an interesting experience recently. David Fontana died, a great transpersonal
psychologist,
scholar and practitioner. He was also a member of the Psychical Research Society. And in the meeting they had afterwards to celebrate his life, they had speakers from the transpersonal, they had speakers from the psychical research. And the people who spoke for the transpersonal seemed quite able, intellectual, capable, made sense, blah, blah, blah. The people from the Psychical Research Society were incredibly low level intellectually, in my opinion. They were boring, they totally unable to distinguish between what was interesting and what was not interesting, went on for hours about, not hours actually, but it seemed like hours, about a radio set that when it was switched off you could hear voices coming from it. And they studied this for 6 years, and the voice...
Let's hope they're not watching this interview, by the way, but yes, go on. Yes.
I mean, this is potty, it really is. And then there was another presentation about spending 5 years searching for ghosts in this particular house, I think it was, and no interesting results that I could detect, after this huge piece of research. So I don't have a lot of respect for the paranormal. I think it's an area that attracts quite dodgy people,
which doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't something important and valid there, of course. But I kind of agree with that.
Well, there are people. I can't remember the name of one very important humanistic writer who says we should pay more attention to the paranormal, and because because humanistic psychology and the paranormal psychology are both rejected by the establishment, they ought to make common cause and actually combine together.
Yes.
Well, that's a view. I haven't adopted it.
And of course, there's a book that came out some years ago, edited by Nick Totten, called Psychoanalysis and the Paranormal, where he assembles a range of writers to write about how psychoanalysis and the paranormal might have something important to say to each other. Yeah.
Well, good luck to them. I don't think there's been a second edition.
Well, I don't know. I don't know.
I don't know.
I suppose. I mean, I could kind of carry on talking about the transpersonal with you for hours, but unfortunately, in this, we have to acknowledge the kind of finitude of reality, and I just kind of wondered whether there's anything that we haven't touched on in this conversation that you think is maybe really important about the transpersonal that you'd like to say before we bring the interview.
Well, there's just one small thing that I'm quite interested in, and that is alchemy. See, alchemy seems to me a typical product of the subtle realm, which is why Jung was so very interested in it. He's a good example of somebody who really spent a lot of time in the subtle and studied it a lot, and so forth. And alchemy. And alchemy says there are a number of stages you go through in transforming lead into gold.
Yes.
And Jung was very interested in this as a psychological process.
Yes.
And quite a lot of the Jungians, Edinger, for example, has written about alchemy. And I've written a whole alchemical account of therapy.
Yes, I've seen it. It's in the International Journal of Psychotherapy, isn't it? Yeah.
All the stages that you might go through in alchemy that correspond to all the same stages you might go through in psychotherapy. And I think that's a very interesting idea. And so I still keep on writing about that to try and get somebody to respond to it, which nobody ever has so far.
Well, it's often forgotten that, or not known, that Newton, who's regarded as the great pioneer of modernist science, spent a great deal of his time researching into what you've just been talking about.
Indeed.
Alchemy, and that's often kind of forgotten. He just didn't sort of sit in orchards waiting for apples to fall on his head. He was also very much into these realms as well. Well, I think we have to kind of bring the interview to an end. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned a huge amount in this quite brief conversation, and I hope the viewers who get to view this will also feel that they've kind of learned a lot. I'm sure they will. And thank you very much, John.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.